Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Ann Arbor Area Transportation Authority Board meeting. It's Thursday, March 16th, and we welcome everyone. First item on our agenda is 1.1, to approve the agenda, and I understand we have some changes or additions.
Yes, Madam Chair, thank you. I'd like to make two requests on the agenda. First, under 1.3 general announcements, wanted to give a board an update on some operational challenges that have happened recently on I-94. And under section 7, I'd like to request that we add a new first item there for updates on recent advocacy trips to Lansing and Washington, D.C.
Okay, so noted. Also, I would like to add a quick update under announcements with regards to the procurement task force, if that's all right with everybody. So with those changes in place, may I have a recommendation to approve the agenda as modified? Susan and Simi seconded. All in favor, say aye, raise your hand. Very good, that motion passed. Oh, there he is. Didn't see Mike. The motion passed unanimously. So now we're on to 1.2, public comment. Deb, is there anyone on Zoom? I don't see anyone here in the main area.
Looks like we have no one for public comment.
Okay, well then moving on then, we are to general announcements, and our first general announcement will be Mr. George Brooks.
Good evening, everybody. Can you hear me? Okay, I just wanted to give you an update on the I-94 Liberty Road Bridge accident and detour that we are experiencing right now. Can everybody see the presentation?
Not yet. All I see is you. There we go.
Okay, there we go. First of all, the problem is that we had a bridge strike. It's negatively affecting two of our lines, the Route 26 and Route 29. As you can see in the picture, significant damage to the bridge. Eastbound 94 is closed. It's going to be out for at least through the end of March. And these are the routes that are affected. The Route 26, both of these, the 26 and the 29, are going to be detoured indefinitely. We figured out that the both affected stops were missing 4 stops total, and it's affecting boarding of approximately 15 passengers a day. And you can see by this slide specifically how many boardings that we anticipate each day. And this is our temporary solution. We are running a detour, and like I said, we're only missing 4 stops. The detour seems to be working well. And estimated time of completion for the repairing of the bridge is tentatively set for March 20th. Any questions?
Does the board have any questions, Jesse?
Thank you. It's a heck of a challenge for so early on in your time with us, but I'm glad that you're here to deal with it. Is it possible to update the real-time routes information that we provide, like for Google Maps and other apps that source that information, so riders know which stops are active or where they should be catching the bus?
I believe it is possible, but I don't want to answer you specifically without direct knowledge and giving you proper information. But I can look into it and give you more detailed information.
All right, thank you.
Okay. Anybody else? Okay.
Thank you, George, very much.
Thank you.
Another announcement I wanted to you know what? I did that incorrectly. We're going to move that down to LTF area, correct? 3.2. So strike what I just said, and we're going to move on to, if there are no other general announcements, we're going to go ahead and move on to the consent agenda. Does anybody want to move that into the record? That would be Jesse, seconded by Rich. All in favor, please say aye. Raise your hand. Aye. All right, that passed unanimously. Thank you very much. Now we're on to ownership linkage. We're using our new board agenda. I don't know if anybody noticed that today. So good work, board. First thing on the agenda is 3.1 OLTF updates, and that's Mr. Chang.
Yeah, I think just the main update I have for all of you is that each of the committees, you'll be getting an email from me with the drafts message that we'd like to send out to administrators for your input and review. So I'm going to send that out probably tomorrow.
Okay.
Just so you know.
Does anybody have any questions for Rich? All right, seeing none, we'll move on. I just wanted to talk real quick about the task force. Let everyone know that the legal procurement task force has been struck, and that will be Kyra, Mike, Simi, and Chris. And we're still in the process of getting members for the governance procurement task force. So far, it would be Susan and myself. We would love 3 minimal, but I would really like to have 4 on that area. We have until the end of March, I believe was the timeline that was given to us by Michelle Whitlow. So if you are interested, please reach out to me. All right, thank you so much. So next on our agenda is monitoring task force update, and that would be Mr. Mike Alleming. Mike?
Yes, thank you. We've talked about, I think, really the last 2 board meetings, what the task force had been working on, and that was an update to the schedule of the monitoring reports that occurred throughout the year, and which is enclosed as attached appendix A in the policy manual. So you had in your package a proposal that we are making, and included in there is the way appendix A is currently put forth, and then we have our recommendation. And we're hoping actually to get a vote on this and get a new policy revision approved. But let me just highlight the major changes. First of all, if you look at the 2 schedules, we've eliminated a couple of columns. One is the method, which we all concluded really wasn't necessary.
Okay, can we hear me?
I can hear you, Rose. Can people hear Rose?
We can hear Rose.
We hear you, Rose. Okay, the method column just has internal or direct inspection, which we didn't think really added anything. Secondly, there were 2 columns that had months in them. One was intended to be the review prior to the board meeting by a committee, and the second column was the actual review at the board meeting, which we didn't think was necessary. The review ahead of the board meeting would just be whatever committee would be reviewing it and before the board meeting. We didn't, in some cases, actually, it has to be in the 1 month prior, depending on the timing of the board meeting. And so those 2 columns got eliminated and changed. Then we looked at the specific schedule. First of all, the frequency, we made a couple of changes to the frequency. You look at 2.0 global executive limitation. It was on their annual, but we decided it really only needed to do every other year. If you look at investments, which was actually on there, is twice a year. We decided that didn't really need to be done twice a year. Only once a year would be good enough. The finance committee is actually looking at investments every quarter, not doing the formal review, but we are looking at them, and we would certainly bring to the board any problems that we would happen to see at that time. The emergency succession, I guess we didn't change that. So I think those were the ones that we changed the frequency of. We then changed a few dates. And let's see, the compensation and benefits. We changed the fair policy. No, excuse me, we changed the emergency succession to another month, and we also changed the construction policy to another month. Just because it seemed to work out better schedule-wise, and also relative to, in a couple of cases, the either a servicing report would be presented ahead of something that would involve servicing, or the same goes for finance. We did change one case where going to be reviewed ahead of the board from the finance committee on compensation and benefits. We thought that really would be a governance or a board direct review. And I think that is the only thing to highlight, except the policies 3.0 through 3.8, 4.0 through 4.4. We changed those around somewhat, and in particular, I want to focus on 3.0 through 3.8. We have been recommending changing the policy back and forth between doing it all at once. They're all related in terms of board governance. And Matt had, and so I think what we're now recommending is splitting them up. But Matt had some comments about that because we have been going back and forth. The thing is, one reason for splitting it off would be there's so much to be covered in 1 month by not only the staff preparing the reports, but by the board reviewing the reports. So we thought that maybe splitting them in half, which we maybe tried one time in the past. This time it's a little bit different, but Matt still, I believe, has some concerns about that. And I think that might be something worth discussing before we actually think about discussing anything else and then thinking about approving the policy. Matt, you made some good comments on that. Would you want to state what you had said?
Sure. Thank you, Mike. But just a little bit of historical context. The board's tried several things over the years in monitoring this. It's a heavy lift. There's a lot of policies in here. Previous feedback from the board had felt like doing it all in 1 month when we first started policy governance felt like a lot. So the board said, why don't we try something different? So the next thing we did was to try stringing it out over the course of an entire year. The problem is, after the first few months, you forgot what you said the first month, and then you had to sort of cross-reference, and that didn't work so well. So we went back to doing it all in 1 month. This time, splitting it in two, I think is worth a shot. I did raise some concerns with the task force, just that we've tried this a couple different ways. But I think it's worth giving it a try, see how it works, see if the board finds sort of that healthy balance that you're looking for in terms of time commitment. That they are back to back in consecutive months will probably help. And I think the key thing here is that you'll do 3.4 through 3.8 in April, and then 3.0 through 3.3 in May, the following month. And it's 3.0 is the one, if we remember, that's sort of the overall policy. So doing that one last, I think, is the important part. To do all the other ones first makes the most sense, and this accomplishes that. So I think it's worth a try, and maybe you'll be happier with this arrangement.
Let me also mention, and you can see on the proposal, we've changed the months for the customer satisfaction service report, which is a quarterly report, and also for the CEO's expense report, just some minor changes in terms of the months. I don't think there's anything there to really discuss. But we sure would like to hear any comments or questions that any of the board members have on what we are proposing within the task force. So I said, we've discussed this a lot, got a lot of input from staff. Rosa Maria helped a lot. And of course, Matt had his input too.
Well, Mike, would you like to open the floor up to the board now for questions?
Yes, please, Kathleen.
All right, we're going to open it up to the board for any questions or comments about what you've seen. Jesse?
I just want to say I very much would like to give the splitting of 3.0 a shot, because it was a lot. I was pretty exhausted. I felt like it took up. I remember at the end, last time we dealt with that, we were rushing through everything else at the end of the meeting, and I didn't want to be rushing through everything else. So I really appreciate this effort. With definitely keeping in mind, I appreciate Matt reminding us that, that we've splitting it up has one way it didn't work in the past, so we'll definitely have to be mindful this time. But I'm in favor of that in particular. I really like all these changes, and I really appreciate the work that the task force has done on this.
Thank you, Jesse. Any other comments or questions for Mike or the task force? Mike, I think it's your intention tonight, if there seems to be no further discussion on this topic, we want to adopt this tonight. Is that how we're moving forward?
Yep. Yes, I would like to move that we adopt this revised Schedule A, or Appendix A, I guess is what it's called, as part of our policies. And let me just mention, relative to Jesse's comment, splitting this in half is still going to be a fairly big lift each half, but it won't be it shouldn't be nearly as difficult as it was before. And it's not on a piecemeal basis either. It's more organized than we had in the past when we tried to split it up. But yes, I would like to move that we adopt this revised Appendix A to the policy manual, which changes the schedule of monitoring. Yes, that's what I would like to move.
Okay, so Mike has a motion on the floor to accept the proposed version of the monitoring Appendix A. Do I have a second?
Second.
Seconded by Rich. Is there any further discussion that's needed on the motion? Seeing none, I'm going to ask for a vote. All those in favor, please raise your hand. Wonderful, that passes unanimously. Thank you, Mike, and to your task force for all the hard work that they've done. And Rose, I know that you've been working with them as well, and staff, so thank you, everyone.
Let me just add a couple of things,
Okay.
Kathleen.
Of course.
What the task force plans to do in their next meeting with the help of Rose is really, we've talked about about how to address review of policies, which is not monitoring, but it is something that's related to monitoring. And so we will be, that will be our main topic at our next meeting. And I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you, Mike. All right, we're going to close out this discussion and move on to 4.2, Board Management Delegation. In your packet is the results from our 4.0 through 4.4. And what I'd like to do, this is different in that this monitoring report does not require a decision. It's us looking at ourselves inwardly, taking a temperature. How are we doing? Where do we need to improve? What are we doing well? What are we not doing well? I have some ideas, but what I really would want to do is open it up to the floor first to see if anybody has any comments or questions about the report itself. Okay, I'm seeing none. I'm not, sorry, I put you on the spot there. I just want to.
No, I do.
Do you? Okay, go ahead, Rich.
This is the one that's always I don't know, I kind of gave that comment at the end that every time I read it, I have to try and figure out what frame of mind I'm supposed to approach this with. And I'm trying to remember why, but I think I put in here maybe a potential change is not to use the board will, but instead use the board is supposed to. Because like for me, it's times I sit there, I'm like, okay, is this supposed to be what the board is supposed to be doing or how we are operating? And I think that's also why in the past, we've had issues with like some folks are saying like, oh yeah, no, we do a particular policy well, and other people were saying like, no, we don't do that well. And then we're like, why is this like such opposite ends? And I think it's an interpretation of how we read those questions. And so I don't know if that's something, I don't know if Rose has any feedback on that. So I think the challenge, if I remember correctly, the last 2 years, we have had in the past like fairly mixed, almost opposite end answers for some of these. It looks like in this time it wasn't that crazy, which is good. But I always worry like when we bring new folks on, I mean, there just seems to be a little bit of muddiness as to how we're supposed to interpret it.
Rose, did you have any thoughts on Rich's suggestion with regards to the wording of, what policy number was that?
It was basically most of them. Yeah, it's just a minor wording change, but I think it actually helps with the interpretation as to how we're supposed to look at interpreting those questions.
Yeah, versus the board will, whereas the board is supposed to, is, I think, Rich's question.
Yeah, not sure that it's going to change people's reactions to it. I mean, I think is supposed to kind of lets the board off the hook a bit, frankly. You're going to say this is how we will conduct ourselves. I don't know. Yeah, I mean, these are your policies. If you want to say we should be doing this, as opposed to we will do this, it's just for me, it's kind of a difference in level of aspiration or level of commitment to action. So, yeah.
Okay, Jesse has his hand up and then we'll go to Mike.
Yeah, I've had the same feeling, but I think might appreciate some clarity, or maybe I think it might be accomplished in some clarification on how we should address the answer to the question. So like, is it like, do you have evidence where we have not adhered to this policy? Because I remember in the past, we have like, some people have said most of the time because they didn't feel like perfection could ever be achieved. And so they didn't want to give a 5, they wanted to give a 4. But like, whereas this time I chose for myself, like, unless I had a concrete example of where we had violated this policy, then I had to assume that we always had adhered to it. So I think maybe if we could come up with some sort of guidance to that effect, it might accomplish what it might address that concern.
Yeah, because there's times when I read this policy, like I look at somebody like, yeah, we're supposed to be doing all this. And so I wasn't sure there's like it's not meant to be, but almost like a test of just like, let's see what the board member believes they're actually supposed to be doing in their role. And then if we answer like something that isn't like, I guess the correct answer, then we're like, gotcha kind of thing. And then we have to go to remedial training. So that's why I always thought
It's not meant to be a gotcha, Rich, honestly.
But that's also because I remember the very first time I took this, I did this monitoring report. I remember, I think it was Mike, he was like, who put all these like really low responses to all his questions? I was like, oh, it wasn't me, because I didn't think I was actually doing a lot of that stuff yet. And so that's why I thought my interpretation, of course, was off base, but that's how I was actually reading the questions of how to interpret this.
Mike, you had a comment or a question?
Yes. And it really had to do with Rich's proposal to use supposed to instead of will. If we, and I understand why he's saying, why he's suggesting that, and he's making a good point there, but I don't agree with his using supposed to, because then we're going to have, what does always mean? We're always supposed to be. So it's always, I would always rate those always, because we're supposed to do it all the time. So I don't think that works unless we also try to address the way we do the ratings. Um, so, and I think Jesse makes a good point there. We could consider um, doing what he was suggesting.
I'm going to put my 2 cents in. The reason I like the word will, it's not the word does. The word will implies that there's room for learning and for growing. It doesn't say the board does this 100% of the time, but we will do these things because everybody is at a different learning level, which led to some of my questions about some of the report. I don't want to bring a lot of it up, but does anybody else have any other questions or comments at this point? No, I just wanted to bring up.
Rose does.
Oh, go ahead, Rose. I'm sorry.
I was going to say, I think Jesse's suggestion about if if not always, then what's an example when we were, or sometime when the board didn't act consistently. I think those are the comments that maybe help you, that give food for learning. Because I also was going most of the time or some of the time, and I'm going, well, when weren't we? Is it consistently some of the time, or so? I think the examples probably would be helpful as learning. Yeah.
Yes, Mike.
I think something that would help a lot is, like, we have put some guidance in terms of the rating of other monitoring reports where the CEO presents it. In this case, we don't really have any guidance, and I think maybe a paragraph or something, or just a couple of sentences could be written to give the board members, particularly new board members, guidance into how they're supposed to look at this.
Go ahead, Matt.
Thank you. Just listening to the debate and taking it all in. An observation. I'm not sure perfection matters as much as effort in this case. Most boards that I'm aware of don't have expectations for themselves set out in advance at all, let alone spend any time reflecting on it. As you are doing here today, you're kind of self-evaluating through this process, which has, I think, a remarkable effect on the integrity and professionalism of the board. So I might offer perfection. Don't worry too much about that. It's the effort that I think really matters.
Thank you for that, Matt. For me, as I was going through the report, what struck me about folks who said most of the time, or the one that concerned me the most if I saw some of the time, is did people ask themselves the question, so here's 4.0. So 4.0 is, one moment. 4.0 is the Global Board Management Delegation. So this is an example. The board's sole official connection to the operational organization, its achievements and conduct will be through a chief executive officer. 4 people said always, 2 people said most of the time, which raised the question in my mind, and Mike may have already asked this, and Jesse, is when did we not do that? When do we not take the CEO and recognize that he is the sole connection? So I think you made a very valid point about maybe having some sort of guidance when these reports come out, just to maybe think about those questions of, has it ever not happened, so that people feel more comfortable. Because I understand that. I was a manager for a while, and sometimes it's like, can somebody really be 100% all the time? There has to be room for growth. And maybe that's what some people were thinking about when they were filling out the report. Although compared to last year, this report was light years ahead. So I feel that everyone did a really good job who participated in filling out this form. Rose, is that something that maybe for the next time we fill out this form, that we could maybe just have a little bit of a guidance at the beginning of, these are the things that you should think about as you're filling it out, because you're right, Mike, it's not like a regular monitoring report. A regular monitoring report comes to us and it has an interpretation and then it has evidence. And this is us solely looking at ourselves and our board and using our experience over the last year to answer the questions for these reports. So maybe some guiding questions may be beneficial.
Yeah, I mean, I think the monitoring task force could probably look at that. I think Matt raised a really good point, which is that, you know, it's not, you're not aiming for, I mean, it would be lovely to be always doing everything that, you know, that you will do. But I think, you know, and I share Kathleen's point is that, you know, I only worry when it says some of the time or none of the time. Right. And I think always or most of the time and all of this is good. And it's, but I also think that you haven't, you know, is there an example of, you know, if you didn't say always, does something come to mind as something that the board could learn from? Because I think it's not, you know, it's not like we're not trying to, you know, call the board up, but saying is, can we learn from this? Like, is there an example that you could, you know, that you have that the board could learn from? So.
Yeah, it was also interesting that some of the comments were, we do this, but we also have to keep in mind state law or this or that. And what wasn't on the report was the very first header, which says these policies define how the board will delegate to its CEO, AAT's accomplishments of ends and operations. So it's strictly talking about the board and its relationship with the CEO versus the relationship of the CEO with state and federal guidelines and all those other things that can muck things up. So maybe we could in the future add that part of it to the top of the form, and that may help give clarification as well. Mike, do you think at the next task force meeting, we could add this to our agenda as something to think about?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay, wonderful. Yeah, Jesse has a question or a comment.
Yeah, I think I really appreciate the task force taking this on. Something maybe to consider is I think there's the rationale that we have to use, like, you know, my own personal rationale of, do I have any counter evidence? I think I also saw in this some maybe some uncertainty about, you know, when is it okay and how is it okay for board members to interact with other members of staff? And so, like, I have my own personal criteria. It's like I don't reach out to any other members of staff without letting Matt know, but I might have some one-on-one after that point, might have some one-on-one email conversations. So having some guidance on that. And then there's,
Take your time.
yeah. It was, no, that one left me. But I think that might be the other thing is, yeah, just some clarification on what some of these mean. Like when it comes to interact, it's not like I need to say, hey, Matt, can you tell Dina what I want her to know?
Mr. Carpenter, Matt.
Thank you. And I think maybe this is a question, and I can bounce it off Rose to make sure what I'm about to say is correct. My understanding of 4.0 is not to say you can't talk to other staff. It's that the board will not issue instruction to any other staff. It's a chain of command saying, and under the board management delegation, this is simply saying your sole official way of issuing direction is to me. So you wouldn't give instruction to Dina if I'm not in the room, unless I had already sort of authorized this, which does happen. And that's sort of, there's a blanket authorization that I've already given, and I'll be happy to reiterate that, you know, particularly the deputy CEOs know that they're available to you guys individually or as a group to answer questions and all sorts of stuff. But I've also made it very clear to staff that individual board members and the board itself don't give them instruction. You guys tell me and I tell them, and that just sort of keeps us all rowing in the same direction and avoids any confusion. That's my understanding, and Rose can correct me if I'm wrong.
Rose?
No, that's absolutely correct.
Yeah, and I think that's what I was getting at. I'm just looking at 4.0, you know, that two people said most of the time, and one of the comments was because we interact with various staff in our committees, and like that, I don't think that is what this policy was getting at. So I think while, I mean, we may all remember that a year from now, it might be good to put it in writing as some guidance so that we for sure can remember it, and for any board members who haven't, new board members, so that we're not re-answering, we're having the same discussion every year.
And that may be the best place to do it, is at the task force, is maybe coming up with something at that level. But I just want to say again that I think that we are growing so well together, that we're really starting to understand these policies and have a really good grasp and understanding of what our jobs are. So this report really showed me that we're on a really good path. So I want to thank everyone for filling out the form. And if there are no other oddities or questions or concerns, we can move on.
Kathleen, I'd just like to,
Oh, sorry, Mike, I did not see your hand.
I'd like to make just one more comment, which is really adding on to what has already been said. Not only have these ratings come much closer together, but I'm very impressed that there's only 2 or 3 some of the times. I mean, I think I wouldn't worry about most of the time or always, but I think we should look at the some of the times, and there's very few of them here, and I think that's very encouraging.
Thank you for that, Mike. All right, next on our agenda is 4.3, the audit update, and that is Ms. Dina Reed.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, so we are currently finishing up the fiscal year 22 financial audit. We have spoken with the task force about the timeline, and I just wanted to give an update to share with you when we expect to present it to the board, when we expect to present it to the state, and where things are at. UHY is our auditor, and they have completed the audit of the financial statements, and they are working on the review of the single audit. And from there, it will go to their principal partners for a final review. They do expect to have the report to us no later than the end of March, which will meet the state requirement for submission, which was our kind of drop dead goal that we were really focused on. Would have liked to had it at this board meeting, but given the timing of the completion of the audit, that's going to be a little bit longer. So the state does not require approval by the board. The board usually accepts the audit once it's presented. So what I've discussed with the audit task force, how we should approach this, and we've agreed that the approach will be when the report is complete, the report will go to the audit task force, and there will be a meeting with the auditors directly and with the audit task force the last week of March before we submit the audit to the state. We'll then submit the audit to the state, and from there present the audit to the finance committee in April in advance of the board meeting, as we normally would do. The auditors will be there to provide feedback, information, and we'll give the finance committee any updates from the audit task force as well. And then from there, we'll present the audit to the board in April at the April board meeting. And that should close it out as long as everything goes well.
Very good. Does anybody have any questions for Dina or comments? As for me, Dina, I just want to thank you and your team. I know that you have done a Herculean job through all of this, and I just want to recognize it, and I would like to say thank you.
Thank you.
I know the report's not in front of us right now, but just know that you are supported.
Thank you.
All right. Next on our agenda is the recommended changes to our construction policy. And Mr. Mike Alamang, you are up again.
Okay, thank you again, Kathleen. Let me find that. We've, of course, talked for several times too at the board meeting about why if we really need to change one paragraph in the construction policy. And I still haven't found it. Just a second. But, and that had to do with the fact in there that that Matt would need board approval before he could submit a grant application. And of course, a earmark came up where he didn't have time to do that. And we don't want that to happen again. So what the finance committee did is take a look specifically at that particular problem and as part of the construction policy. And you can see what we have proposed in there. First of all, was not really to change the construction policy, except to change is to not narrow the application just to grant applications, but to funding applications, which is a little broader category because you, as Matt has pointed out, there could be something that wasn't technically a grant that wouldn't have time to be submitted to the board before he had to submit it to whoever the particular funding body might be. So that's the only change in the actual construction policy itself. And that really doesn't technically address the problem that we were talking about that started this whole thing. But what the finance committee believes is the best way to handle that is in the policy that addresses committee structure, and specifically there is a executive committee. I believe since the policy has been written, we have not ever had an executive committee meeting, but you can see if you have the language in front of you of the current policy. There we go. And you want to move down to there, down to the 3.7.2A. First, what's in there currently, B is going to be superseded because you look at task force appointments and one-off issue, emergent issues, you could interpret that almost any way you wanted to. So we didn't think that that was a good thing to leave in there. And also, A, as it currently stands, limited executive powers, and then listing a couple of examples is more specific, but we wanted to make it actually more specific than that. And that's why we have on there what we're proposing for 3.7.2A. And let me just read it, which I think narrows it down to what needs to be covered and not makes it broader than needs to be. And that's time-sensitive decisions where approval is needed before the next board of directors meeting. But that's limited to those things that are mainly referred to up above in the old A, limited to acting CEO appointments, urgent purchases, and funding applications for construction projects, which is really what mainly we're talking about here. And then what happens then? If the executive committee makes a decision on behalf of the board under those circumstances where the board doesn't have a chance to meet, it will notify the board no later than 3 business days after that decision is made. And the finance committee feels quite comfortable, and I think Matt's in agreement that this will cover this circumstance that we ran into in the past that may certainly happen in the future, again, because earmarks at least are back for the time being. So anyway, the finance committee is recommending the changes that you see on this schedule in front of you.
Mike, would you like to open the floor up for questions?
Yes, I sure would.
All right, the floor is now open to the board for questions. I see Rich has his hand up, and then we'll go to Simi.
Thanks. I like these changes a lot. The only question I really had was around just like the no more than 3 business days. Was there like a logic behind choosing that number, or just kind of seemed like a good one to pick?
Well, the logic was only that seemed to be a reasonable period of time to do that. Certainly that could change. I mean, that could be tightened up, and I think could be adhered to, but it was just kind of a middle of the ground, what we thought was reasonable to inform the board. But I certainly am not necessarily wedded to that particular time.
Okay, yeah, I just, yeah, I don't know, like, it just seems like a pretty big gap, but I'm not that picky around it. But I just feel like there could be a situation, but I mean, it is no more than, and we all have brains, and I think if there's something that, like, the scenario I'm thinking about is if there's a decision that has to be made that could potentially go into the press, and then they start calling around, and then board members are like, whoa, I don't know what you're calling me or asking me about that scenario, but I have a feeling that the executive committee is going to let us know ahead of time, so that probably wouldn't be a scenario. So that was the only reason why I was asking.
Simi?
I also think these changes make a lot of sense. I just think the phrase, well, I wonder if saying applications for construction projects in 3.2A, the replacement language, would that limit us if another funding opportunity came up that wasn't in construction? You know, if it was any sort of grant beyond that or funding opportunity. So I just wonder if that would be limiting ourselves and needing to come back and modify that language in the future. I think the phrase could be changed from funding applications for construction projects to just funding opportunities overall or something like that. That's my only concern.
My recollection is, and Matt can correct me, is that Matt thought that that was the only time that would have that time constraint, and that we didn't want to make this broader than maybe was necessary. But Matt, please comment on that, because I'm attributing it to you.
If I'm remembering correctly, Mike and Matt, you can correct me if I'm wrong, is these changes are being looked at because we had an opportunity for an earmark that came up between board meetings and the staff decided to punt and go for it, which we were very grateful for. That mostly funding and grant applications are on a normal cycle. And this is only for one-off unusual things, not all funding. Am I getting that correct?
If I might.
Yes.
So this whole discussion pertains only to construction projects specifically. I am authorized by all the policies you have to submit grant application and earmark requests for any other sort of funding. It was because of the need for a financial control, the perceived need by the board for a financial control on construction projects specifically, because they were so big, so permanent, and represented a commitment of the agency that the board wanted to make sure that it was really something they were comfortable with before I start putting in earmark or grant requests for construction projects only. Again, scale, size, permanent. There are earmark requests that we can put in for bus replacements or any other number of things that I do not need your authorization on. We're just pursuing the funding to advance your agenda, and we will do that as expediently as possible. This only applies to construction. For that reason, I do kind of like the language in red there, that it specifies and funding applications for construction projects, just to avoid any future misunderstandings.
Did that help, Simi?
Yep, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
Wonderful. I see Rose has her hand up.
It's it's just a small, excuse me, addendum to what Matt has said, which is that the funding for construction projects is the only decision the board has put off limits. You know, so it says it can't make those decisions. So this enables the decision in times of time constraint to be made. So.
Yes, Mike.
I think it might be helpful for Matt to describe to the board. Now I'm talking about capital projects. What capital projects you need the board approval for, and what capital projects you don't need the board approval for, because we've discussed that with you. And I think the whole board, if they're not familiar with that, should know that.
Sure. Thank you. Broadly speaking, the board reviews the entire capital budget and approves it every year. We have a rolling 10-year capital budget in every annual budget. That's where you make a decision about what we're doing in each calendar year. When we're pursuing funding for capital projects, it's those projects, the ones you have approved as per the budget. When we're going after an earmark is just a funding mechanism. It's not the approval of that project per se. So bus replacements are a very common earmark request. You already approved bus replacements as part of the capital budgeting process. We're just seeing an opportunity to get some free money for it, so we're going to try to take that. As Rose has said, the only constraint you've put on me in pursuing these outside sources of funding, which we do, to bring in as much money as we can, the only constraint is on construction projects specifically. And that, I think, is just a check to make sure the board is okay with such a permanent request. And really, I sort of brought this forward with the arrival of earmarks to say, what if a future CEO felt pretty confident that you guys were okay with a big construction project, put in the earmark, Congresswoman Schaefer in the future says, yeah, here's the money, and I come to you and go, hey, I got the money for this big building, and you say, well, that's not what we wanted. We don't approve that building. We can always send the money back. We're not committed to it, but that would be incredibly embarrassing and would harm the agency's credibility. So we want to sort of avoid that sort of scenario by putting a sort of a financial control and a check in here for construction projects only, simply because of their size and permanence and cost.
Thank you for that clarification, Matt. Mike, I'm looking on the form here and it has a little M for info type. It's just monitoring. But with the discussion that's been on the floor, I'm wondering if we want to make a motion and move this forward? Or do you feel it might still be too early?
No, I would like to move that the board accept this revision to the construction policy and to the policy that addresses the executive committee.
Okay, so Mike has made a motion to move this forward. Do I have a second? Seconded by Simi. And is there any further discussion on the motion itself? Seeing none, all in favor, please raise your hands. Give me a second to look. And that passed unanimously. Thank you, everyone. And thank you, Mike, and to the Finance Committee, Rose, Matt, Rosa Maria, everyone who worked so hard on that. We appreciate you. Next on our agenda is our feedback from Ms. Mercier with regards to our ends policy discussion that we had last month. Thank you, Rose, for being here. We are glad to have you.
You're welcome. It's a pleasure. I just wish my speaker was making me crazy. It's been like this all day. So I did prepare, as you know, a coaching advisory, and I'm assuming you've had time to read it. So I thought maybe if I just kind of opened the floor for some questions to begin with. Well, no, let me tell you what I did first. So I listened to your discussion twice, just so I made sure that I kind of could capture what the gist of the conversation, if you will. And as I said, what really struck me was the discussion around the reasonableness of evidence. And as I said, reasonableness of evidence is not a consideration. Reasonableness of interpretation is for sure a consideration. And then I just, as I read the monitoring report, it struck me that there were some things in the evidence that might be better positioned as part of the interpretation, which would make the evidence much easier to present and to correspond. So I worked only with what was there, and tried to sort of if you will, rejig it in a way that maybe was helpful in thinking about it. Because I think then you could go back and say, okay, is the interpretation, reasonable as stated? Because right now it's the evidence supports the interpretation that was there, but it's, I think, question really, as I listened to that, was really about the is the delineation or the, if you will, the definition of what persons with lower income are, is it reasonable to have it just defined in that limited of a way? That's kind of what I'm going, okay, that feels like it might be the gist. So as I teased out what I would say is was the interpretation, what I would do as evidence, I thought that might facilitate a conversation. Anyway, that was that part. There were a couple of other questions which I didn't address because I was trying really hard to get this done for Friday at 4. Was about can the board change its mind in the course of discussion? Of course, it can change its mind. And I think the other piece for me that struck me is that might be useful to prepare in advance motion to be presented to the board based on what the board has provided. And then at least you have a motion on the floor and you can say, yes, this makes sense or doesn't make sense. So yeah, anyway, that's my kind of feedback on this, is because I'm going to just shut my door because we're going to have extra noise here.
So Rose, shall we open it up to the board for any
Yes,
questions or
please.
discussion?
Yes, yeah. Sorry.
So anyone can please feel free to chime in if you have any questions about Rose's coaching advisory, or if you have anything that may not be in the coaching advisory, but that you remember that you might want to get some clarification on. Now would be a really good time. Jesse?
I'm going to be very focused on this particular example because it's easier for me to think about. But I think, and it is one that I have a particular issue with, as evidenced by our discussion last month, particularly with use of Medicaid as as the proof that someone, I guess, with Medicaid in particular, there are so many other barriers to getting Medicaid that even with your rewriting of the, with your resorting of things, I still don't find anything here that tells me that everyone who would meet the, who live at 138% or lower of the federal poverty level can easily get Medicaid. There are so many other institutional barriers to getting Medicaid that I don't feel that Medicaid is. I see no evidence that Medicaid is a good standard to judge whether or not someone actually qualifies for the income. Like, because he's saying that income is like we're wanting to offer a fare to people of low income. We're not offering a fare to people on Medicaid, and I think those are two separate things.
And I would say that the conversation that you're initiating, all right, makes sense in light of the way. So what I tried to do is reconstruct the monitoring report so that the conversation was about the interpretation of what, second here, the residents with lower income status. Sorry.
Okay.
So it's just so that having this conversation that you're initiating now makes some sense, the way the policy is the way that I rejigged the report, all right? Because before the conversation was about, is the evidence reasonable? I'm going like, the evidence is okay if you shift it around, that I think it's legitimate to say, is this a reasonable interpretation of people with economic.
Okay, so the question, so you're saying the question is valid because now because Medicaid, we're judging the reasonableness of the interpretation,
interpretation.
which includes, the interpretation is that people on Medicaid are, the people who qualify for the low-income fare.
Yeah.
Okay, rather than saying, as evidence that all low-income people have access to the fare, we accept Medicaid. Like, we accept the Medicaid card, that's where
Yeah,
they got
it was,
reasonable.
yeah,
Okay.
and so what I tried to do was, like I said, is to say, okay, which parts of this are really the interpretation and what's the evidence that's provided? So I worked with what's there, and then I think you can think about, okay, is this interpretation reasonable? And at this point, that would be a conversation I think you could have the way it's rejigged. Now, this is me taking that license to do that, and I think clearly this is it's the CEO's job, not my job, to write the monitoring report. But tried to just, like I said, I tried to hear what the conversation was about and try and figure out how to facilitate that conversation in a way that made sense.
So how could we have had a productive conversation about this at the last board meeting with the report as it was presented? We got into this big this big discussion whether it was even fair to be criticizing were the objections reasonable, or how could we have handled that? I mean, now that you've come in and straightened things out for us, but we didn't have that benefit last month.
Yeah. I think the conversation was hard to have because of the way the report was organized. And I provide, I do provide feedback on monitoring reports from time to time, sort of before they go to the board, but so then it becomes, and then it's harder, I think, for the board to say, we're judging the interpretation. I think as it was presented, the board's approach was appropriate, but I think it was frustrating because, like I said, I just tried to move things into a place so you could see how it might otherwise flow. So.
Matt, you look like you wanted to say something.
Yeah, I have a question for Rose, and I do appreciate her reformatting. It even makes better sense to me, and I appreciate the clarity that I saw. It makes sense to me that as Jesse is saying, we're saying low income equals Medicare eligible, that is something that could be questioned. My question to Rose is on the word reasonableness and assessing reasonableness of an interpretation. And my understanding is how this is structured. The board should accept any reasonable interpretation, any being the thing there, not reasonable, but any reasonable interpretation. In part because that's a trigger that if you look at what I submit to you and you go, okay, yeah, that technically meets any reasonable interpretation, that's there as a trigger for you to think about the written policy, to be more clear about your expectations, rather than us trying to backdoor it through the CEO's interpretations. You just go ahead and tell me what you want, rather than having to haggle it out about my interpretations. However, so that's my understanding, Rose, of how that mechanism is supposed to function. Is that roughly correct?
Yes, and this is, I will walk in the limbs, is if the majority of the board assess the interpretation as reasonable, then that's where you end up with reasonable. Is if the conversation comes up, right, about saying, it's like, okay, there is a rationale for this that's, defensible, but it's really narrow, and it might not have been our intention in writing this policy for it to be that narrow. And should we look now, which I think is part of the conversation that came up, is should we be looking at this policy? And I think you could certainly look at it and narrow the range of possible interpretations by, being clear about what you mean by.
Yeah,
With
and
economic challenges. Yeah, you could
Yeah.
certainly write that. You could certainly narrow, public transportation options. But I think where you end up in this place of and this is always challenging, right, in a board, is to say where you've got which is, I think, the end result at the last meeting was that the majority of the board determined that there was evidence of a reasonable interpretation. Notwithstanding, right? I think Jesse voted against that motion. And so, that's still a legitimate board decision. But I think the conversation was such that it would say, maybe we want to rethink the policy a little bit. We want it so that we're clear about what it is we intend. Can we narrow the interpretation that's available? And or, as CEO going like, that's interesting. How else might we interpret, this policy? So, there's a couple of avenues you might go down.
I guess my question is there a shorthand way for the board to realize in the future, or some list of questions they can ask themselves to help distinguish, is our concern here with the policy or the interpretation? Because I feel like that's kind of where we got hung up last time. And if the board really wants to not accept the interpretation, as the CEO, I'm fine with that. It's perfectly in their purview. But I kind of feel like we were going in circles on that point. Maybe other people feel differently, but I'm just looking for a shortcut to sort of know which animal we're dealing with.
Could I respond? I really felt that we were having a debate on reasonableness. I don't feel I feel like what you're saying like implies that reasonableness is like some like absolute like clear thing, and I don't. My impression is that we are debating whether or not your interpretation is reasonable. It is something debatable and to be debated. And I think that's what we did. And I came out. I voted saying that I did not think that it was reasonable, and other board members did. I think we're entitled to a difference of opinion on that as long as we adhere once the vote happens. I don't feel like we were going around in circles. I felt like we were having a debate about reasonableness. I don't think reasonableness is an absolute, like something that with a little bit of clarifying knowledge can be just known by reading it.
But I think reasonableness has 4 criteria, right? Like is there a measure? Is it justifiable? Is how much of that measure to be achieved specified? And is there a defensible rationale for that? And that's the definition of reasonableness. It's not so individually determined, right?
So in that point though, would Jesse's point been, it's not a defensible measure to say Medicaid is the definition of low income?
And that's it exactly. I was saying you did not have a defense.
So
Medicaid covered encompassed all low income people in our area.
If we were to say it that way, Rose, to say, Jesse in the future says, under 0.4, I don't think this part of it, the interpretation, is reasonable, or doesn't clear the threshold of any reasonable interpretation. And we keep saying, is it reasonable versus any reasonable interpretation? And I still think the word any is important there. But if we could be that clear with each other in the future about the specificity of which issue is bothering us, that could probably help us, the board, better target our comments and our discussions and come to a conclusion.
Mm-hmm.
And those are the same criteria of interpretation that exist in the survey form.
Yes, they are. For good reason.
Yes, thank you.
Those are the criteria, yeah.
Mike, you have your hand up?
Yes, thank you. Uh, Looking at the actual policy right now and how Matt interpreted that, the policy simply says people with economic challenges have affordable public transportation options. To me, the interpretation of that would be very simple. It has to define people with economic challenges. You got to interpret that, right? And have affordable public transportation options, define that. And to me, that's the interpretation. Now, the things in here that deal with Medicaid eligibility, low-income population were presented in the evidence session. And I think if those kind of things were presented as interpretation rather than evidence, that would have made this a lot clearer. And I think we wouldn't have had all this back and forth, not understanding in the debate that we did have.
Okay.
Rose, did you want to respond?
Yeah, I would, but I'm not 100% sure I understand Mike's point. So,
Okay. Do you have the policy in front of you, Rose? People with economic challenges
yeah, I've got that.
have affordable public transportation options. It seems to me you've got to interpret what it means to say people with economic challenges.
Yeah, and that
And you
is
also
in the
have
way,
to,
okay, but in the way I rewrote it, that's exactly what we did, right? Is say, I'm defining people with economic challenges as this.
yeah, I'm looking, yeah, I'm not looking at yours right now, Rose, but yes.
Yeah.
So that needs to be defined in the interpretation. And if it was, I think Jesse and other people could very legitimately say, that's not a reasonable interpretation and list. And I don't have the criteria in front of me, but for one thing, there's nothing in there about measurement. Until you get into the evidence part.
Into the original, in the original
In
monitor.
the original. Yes.
All right. So say what?
Mm.
Yeah. Yeah,
Uh,
yeah, it's a challenge like that. So,
Rich has a question for you, Rose.
It's not really, I guess, a question. I think it's more a ask of the board. I mean, to me, it just seems like we need to evaluate this policy and give it a little more detail as to what we want to have measured and have Matt actually use as part of his interpretation. Because remember, like one of the questions I had was all the data was really around fixed route. And I asked around like Gold Ride and A Ride, because the way I read the interpretation, I was saying like, hey, the only people that are economic challenge are fixed ride riders, when in fact there's actually folks that I'm sure that use A Ride and Go Ride that are economically challenged, but they have no choice but to use those services over fixed ride. And so for me, I think like moving forward, my question is, do we just take a look at this policy and try and put some more details as to what we expect so that when Matt does his interpretation, he's a little more ideas to what we're looking for. Like the stuff that Jesse brought up can be part of that policy modification. So I think it's valid what he's asking.
yeah. So yes, you can look at the policy for sure, Rich, and just say, does it say precisely enough, right? Because what you're doing when you write a policy is you're saying, we've considered the full range of possible interpretations and we've settled here, right? We want to say is like, we think that policy is too broad, and we want to make sure, because when you add a level to a policy, what you're really doing is saying is that any interpretation will be reasonable as long as it says this, right? You don't want to, what you don't want to do is try to figure out, add measures in, right? Like that's not the job of the board. The board really wants to say is we want to be really clear about what result do we want the organization to produce? What are the benefits? So if it's, if affordable public transportation's options isn't is too broad for the board, you could say, what do we mean by, do we want to further specify what options are? So probably, I think, given the amount of conversation about the policy, it's probably worthwhile looking. Would be my sense.
Jesse?
Yeah, I definitely think, I think those are two distinct, not separate, but two distinct issues. And that, yeah, I think there probably is some work to do on the policy, and I'm, wondering, maybe we need to have something in in limitations about administrative barriers, but I'm not wanting to rehash that discussion. But I did have to the other question about, where and when reasonableness can be discussed. And you're saying that, evidence, we don't just the reasonableness of evidence, we justify the reasonableness of interpretation. Is it fair to say that if the CEO is writing anything that he thinks might be up for debate, that's a pretty clear indication that it should be in the interpretation section, not the evidence?
Oh, I'm not sure how to answer the question. I think if the interpretation, right, like, so this is, I would say this to everybody, is that when the interpretation is well done, the evidence becomes matter of fact, right? Like the interpretation should be written such that anybody could go and find exactly the same evidence, right? It becomes very self-evident what you have to. So evidence to me is really simple. What's the result? When did you collect the information? What's the source? Don't know how that becomes debatable.
I actually have a further question to add to this, because I completely understand what Jesse is saying, that Medicaid does not encapsulate everyone who is low income.
Mhm.
We had asked Matt to maybe ask around about what other mechanisms might already be used that he may not be aware of. And I'm wondering if, number one, he found that out. But number two, I'm wondering, this is a delicate thing in terms of, okay, if we tell Matt Medicaid is not enough, are we then getting meansy and and telling him what he has to do in his operations? I mean, can you please help me unpack that?
So, I mean, I think when you look at there is a measure and there's a rationale for that measure that's presented. I mean, you might contest whether, in fact, the measure that's chosen is reasonable.
Thank you. Are there any other questions or comments for Rose or about this report, and feedback on how we should proceed? Because I don't feel like this discussion is done. Yes, Matt?
I just wanted to thank Rose and the board for this discussion. I found Rose's reconstitution of the interpretation very helpful. I feel like I have a slightly better impression of how to do a better job in writing this next time, and how to engage with the board in terms of discussions of, is it reasonable? I think I see Jesse's point a little bit more directly now. I think it's a reasonable, I shouldn't have used that word. Is within the bounds of policy governance's discussion. I don't know how to say that. Similarly with Rich's point about fixed route versus others. I would like to actually work with Rosa to see if we updated this, what would it look like? And maybe this can be sort of a dummy practice target, since you have already accepted the monitoring report at the last board meeting, and that's sort of done. Maybe one way forward is to sort of use this as a straw man to help us all learn just how to have these discussions going forward, and we can beat it up without the pressure of having to accept it or approve it or anything like that for a little while. And coincidentally, if that's seems like a reasonable way forward, I can also offer that we have been in conversation with staff. Turns out we do accept things other than Medicaid. So I was not entirely factually accurate in my statement. So that's for me to sort out on the back end. So I might actually have a better piece of news for you there as we go forward. But the fixed route thing still stands. So if you want, we could use this as a straw man, just as a practice target, if you will.
If we use it as a practice target, do we want to ask the service committee to look at the practice target before it comes to the full board?
Oh, you should definitely give it to Jesse.
You kind of opened yourself up for that, sir.
I would be very proud to take this on.
Well, it sounds like we've done a really good job tonight of wrapping this up. And Jesse, thank you for taking this on, sir. And thank you to your committee. It's all coming, service committee.
In all seriousness, is this a directive to the service committee to address the, like, are we kind of doing are we pretending as if we had not accepted the report and we're asking Matt to bring it back to us, and we are also going to and is this a formal request to take a look at the language?
Good question. Matt, you have your hand raised?
If it pleases the board, I'd like to use this as a straw man to learn with you, if you're okay with me working with the service committee and then reporting back to you.
Okay.
I think that might be best, Jesse, if we start off with using it as the straw man, you said?
Or target practice, either,
Okay,
either mixing my metaphors.
And then once he brings that report to you and gives you the evidence and all of that, then we can maybe look at policy after that.
Okay, agreed.
Okay, excellent.
Is that okay with you, Rich? All right.
Thank you, Rose, so much for your involvement tonight. We really appreciate you.
Very welcome.
All right, if there's no further discussion on this topic, we're going to go ahead and move ahead. We had earlier approved for MPTA and APTA to be discussed as 7.1. Mr. Carpenter, that would be you to start this conversation.
Thank you very much. And I think any board discussion that we can end with hysterical laughter is a good discussion. So thank you. You may recall that our long-range plan draws attention to the need for support from outside decision makers in order to advance our broader agenda, particularly zoning decisions, bus lanes, a variety of funding issues. There's a lot of outside decision makers that we need to need their support for. So the long range plan specifically lays out advocacy as something we need to be working on, and particularly targets local, state, and federal governments as key partners in that area. Setting aside the local side of it, because I'm just not there yet, I wanted to start getting us more experience with the state and federal before we had anything crucial. We're actually in a really good position right now. We have an earmark for the YTC. We already had one big win. We're in between big asks, if you will. So I wanted to take this opportunity this year to frankly get some practice in and begin to deputize board members into the advocacy process in Lansing and Washington, D.C. Advocacy is a means. We've discussed this and therefore delegated to the CEO. But if you remember my three-legged race analogy, with the ownership linkage task force, it gets so close to linking with the legal owners sometimes that it's a little hard to tell. I don't want to make it, too big of a thing, but I wanted to make sure we're starting to get practice. So seeing as how the state and the feds are both on the same fiscal calendar, they start their budget discussions around March for decisions in September. So both our state Transit Association, the Michigan Public Transit Association, or MPTA, and the National American Public Transit Association, APTA, both of them have legislative conferences, trade association meetings in state and federal capitals in March. So I reached out to a couple of board members, asked them to attend these with me and some staff for the first time. Really, again, as a practice run, let's see what this is like. Let's learn from it when we don't have anything really big on the table. All of you are here tonight, so what I'd like to do is just sort of provide a high-level overview of how this went, then ask the board members and staff who attended as well for their thoughts and feedback. Because I hope this becomes sort of an annual thing where we can make pilgrimages to the state and federal capitals, and we get really, really good at it, because that's something we're going to need to do if we're going to advance our long-range plan. So very quickly, I'll draw your attention to this item. It's at your tables. The federal and state approach is roughly the same. The association the difference is really scale, Michigan versus the country, and the degree of sophistication at hand in terms of the amount of money and the number of members that are going into it. The state association has about 60 members. APTA has several thousand. So obviously just a very big difference of scale. But they kind of follow the same format, and this gives you a general sense of what that looks like. The state association will come up with talking points, that they all have their own legislative committees, they have their own executive directors and staff, so they develop these sorts of things. There's usually background information as part of that, buttressed by, if you look towards the end, where it says Midwest Strategies on the top, there are professional advocates engaged here to help us navigate these various areas. The federal one is more sophisticated, you can tell, because it's in color and it's on harder cardstock. So I'll pass that out so you can see what that looks like, but it follows a similar format. I'm afraid I don't have as many as these. APTA, very similar to MPTA. We'll just pass them along maybe. Very similar ones there. We're also a member of a smaller advocacy group at a federal level called the Bus Coalition. Whereas APTA covers rail as well as bus, the Bus Coalition just focuses on bus, and we'll pass those along. You can have a look at that material as well. So we meet as groups, we review background material. Usually there are some sort of lectures, we receive some information, we confer about these speaking points. We're hunting as a pack, as you might imagine. Every individual agency sort of takes these, uses what's relevant to them, grabs additional things and adds them, adds their own spin on it. If they have a particular request they want to make, a particular bit of education they need to provide to a local elected official, they can do it. And then that's done. And then it's time to go out and meet your elected officials. And we have organized in advanced appointments. We go and sit down with either the elected officials or their staff, and we had a bit of a hit or miss. We got mostly staff this year, and that happens sometimes. But we had really good meetings. All in all, I felt it was a successful meeting. I hope the other participants did as well. It was really good, I think, as a practice run in particular, sort of get everybody sort of into the groove and familiar with the rhythms of it. So with that, I'd like to invite the board members who attended to share their experiences, what their learnings were, what their insights were. And I'd like to start with the state and then go to the feds. And so look to you, Madam Chair, and Rich, who were with me in Lansing. And then after that, Jesse and Susan, who came with me and Dina to Washington.
Yeah, I'd be happy to kick it off, Matt, and then I'll have Rich join me. First of all, I want to say it was an amazing experience. Thank you for including us. It was a 2-day event. The first day of the event, I learned so much because I was able to attend the MPTA board meeting and watch some of their presentations and meet some of their folks. And it was insightful, and I think we were actually holding the other agencies and helping to lift them up because there were no other board members, to my knowledge, that were there. So it was a way for us to be seen, but also maybe help encourage them to help their boards be seen as well. We had the pleasure on March 8th of meeting with Representative Felicia Babbitt's, was it the LD or her chief of staff? I can't remember.
It was the legislative director,
Okay.
Claudia.
Okay. We also we were able to meet with Representative Jimmy Wilson Jr. We met with him directly. We met with Senator Jeff Irwin's LD legislative director, Alexi Chapin-Smith. And then we also had breakfast with Senator Sue Shink, person. Her name was Sydney Hart, and she actually spent quite a lot of time with us. We were very pleased. We were watching and observing the room, and she stayed with us almost the entire breakfast, which to me spoke volumes. I think that meant that we were engaging and we spoke to something that she wanted to listen and learn. It also was helpful to learn that she has a history in transportation out of Hawaii. So she had a lot of really good pointed questions. And as I was looking around the room, some people only stayed for 10 or 15 minutes and then got up and left. So the fact that she stayed with us for a good half hour was really telling to me. We're also going to meet with Jason Morgan tomorrow. We're going to have lunch with him. He was not available that day, but I believe he's in Ann Arbor for a little while, so we're going to be able to meet with him. I was so grateful for their generosity of sharing their time with us and being so open. And I also think it was helpful having board members there with Matt, because it gave the staff and the representatives and senators another layer of what is happening in the transportation industry. So Matt spoke mainly to operational issues, and we talked about the asks that are on here. MPTA had 3 asks that they were asking us to support because we weren't there having asks directly for ourselves. So we were supporting the entire state of Michigan while we were there, but also we were able to give personal stories. And as I'm growing older and learning, stories is really the way that people remember you. You can give them statistics, you can give them all the data that you want, talking points and things like that. But when it really comes down to people meeting with people, and that's what our senators and our representatives and their staff are. They're people like us. What they're going to remember is our stories. So I was really grateful that Matt was able to allow us to have time to be able to share some personal stories. And I think that, you know, they're going to take that away and really, hopefully that's going to be memorable to them. So Rich, what was your experience like?
It was definitely mirrors. It was a very positive experience. I highly recommend that other board members, next upcoming events that you participate. I found it, well, I think one reason why the legislatures actually spent a lot of time with us, to the point that quite a few of them, they actually ran out of time. Like their execs had to come and be like, hey, you got another meeting to go to, because the discussion was actually so deep. And I think part is because we were actually there to not really give information, which was nice. We had specific asks, but we also weren't complaining. Where I have feeling a lot of times, like people that want to talk to them is because they're just like upset about something, and so they felt, I think it was probably worthwhile for them to spend some time, everything and do to actually really advance public transportation, which every single one of them, it was really important to them, which was, I think, critical for us. The one I gotta say, I was really impressed with Matt. It's just, I mean, there's a lot of nuances, and there's times like if I could, my mouth would have just been hanging up because I was like, wow, like he navigated that so well. And I learned a lot from that. The visibility into what we as an organization have to work with, especially around policy, but also that there are some policies that we need to have changed, or that for the general public is good for them, but in the end, it actually affects us in kind of negative ways. So for instance, is the legalization of marijuana. One of the discussions we learned, like actually that affects some of the agency's ability to hire people because of the way that testing is done right now. And I was like, holy cow, I didn't ever think that would actually be an issue, and it is. And it was really neat also to hear other organizations that belong to MPTA and hearing the shared challenges, right? So especially like the one around hiring. So yeah, I really appreciate it. I enjoyed it. I don't know if you knew what the 3 things that we were asking for. One was like this thing called the LBO, which is like the local bus operating. It's actually a pretty big pot of money that this year the governor is very supportive of that, and they actually gave an increase. And one of the asks was, instead of the $15 million increase, was actually asked for $5 million more out of that. So $20 or $20 million more. There's a transit capital piece to ask, of course, right, because capital is what we need, especially like to build the bus, the new bus station in Ipsy. And then there was something that I learned about, which is what they call Section 5310, which is really focused on small organizations. And one of the things this is again was a learning experience for me, is folks like Jewish Family Services actually fall under that because they actually do provide transportation for the people that they serve. And I went, oh, I totally didn't realize that they get funding from like that. So yeah, it was just a very big learning experience, and I think it furthers my ability to help govern this organization a lot more. So I highly recommend it.
So Susan or Jesse, they both attended the APTA meeting. Which one of you would like to go first? Jesse.
So, yes, Susan and I attended the APTA Legislative Conference this past Sunday through Tuesday, along with Matt and Dina, and it was fantastic. It was pretty amazing to be amongst a group of so many organizations. We had we're, I guess, a kind of small to mid-sized organization, and so, but we were there, shoulder to shoulder with people from LA and Chicago, and also smaller agencies, and it was really interesting to have to kind of hear what everyone was dealing with, to have the opportunity to speak with them. I had an opportunity to have a short conversation with the president of the Chicago Transit Agency, he was part of several panels, including one about equity, that was really enjoyable. So the conference took the format of, there were several days of educational sessions, and then there was the last day was when we actually had meetings on the Hill with the staffs of Senators Stabenow and Peters and Representative Dingell. The keynote was given by Deputy Secretary at US DOT, Polly Trottenberg. She stressed the importance of project readiness in getting grants, which I think we can really take to heart. And I'm really, this whole trip, I was really so thankful for the millage vote, because that puts us in a position to, like she was saying, they basically get so many of these applications. You better have you have your proposal in one hand and your shovel in the other. And I think like we're going to be well positioned to do that. There were a lot of talk about national issues, also issues that are facing maybe larger agencies, things that are coming up in the budget that the Biden administration just proposed. One that might ring with us is that there's a proposal to allow larger agencies to take advantage of the mechanism that we just stopped taking advantage of with the millage, to allocate federal capital costs towards operational spending. The agencies that are more dependent on fair revenue than we are very interested in doing that as a short-term thing. And actually, Senator Stabenow's office had really wanted our opinion on that, and Dina in particular gave a lot of really good input on that. So it was really nice to talk to people like our representatives of their staffs who were very, they were involved and really wanted to hear our opinions on things. So we also heard a talk from the Nuria Fernandez, administrator, the FTA. She talked a lot about what was in the budget, and talking a lot about capital projects and capital funding. There was an equity panel, which I think Susan and I both particularly enjoyed. They talked about the CTA expanding service down on the south side. Talked about programs where they leveraging infrastructure spending to benefit historically underutilized businesses. So like when they were hiring contractors, efforts to hire historically underutilized businesses. And then there was a session on effective communication, and that storytelling, like you were talking about, a lot of talk about that, which also served us really well during our sessions with the congressional staffs. There was a really great someone from MARTA down in at Atlanta. They had a lot to say. So I think something that we can probably take. How about how they were able to lobby and market to achieve regional support for a BRT line? They like brought a lot of their electeds over to look at a line that had been installed in Indianapolis, and they had this whole marketing thing, and they had they achieved a lot of a unanimous support from their county commissioners, which sounds like it's just as rare there as it is here. And especially because it was being presented as an alternative to light rail. There were a lot of people who were really into rail, but they wanted, so there was a lot. It was just going from one thing to another, but then also having a chance to talk to, and I promise I'm almost done, having a chance to talk to the staffs on the Hill. We didn't have any asks for them. We basically, at this point, we're wanting to thank them for what they've given us so far. The earmark that Dingle championed for us, and that all three of them voted for, the earmark that Senator Peters gave us for planning for the YTC, and I think they really appreciated that we were wanting to be good stewards of that money. They wanted to hear what we were doing with it, and we told them that we will be coming back. Matt particularly highlighted coming back for the NOLO grants next year for starting a transition to a zero emission support fleet. Yeah, it was a whirlwind trip, but it was exciting and very, very informative and productive, I think.
You left absolutely nothing behind for me to talk to, which is just perfect. No, you nailed it really well. And I guess I'll end in sort of a big statement, which was what we heard again and again is we're at a transformative time. And I know we feel it here at the agency, and with our long-range plan, we spoke to our community, we heard it from them as well. But we heard it there in DC from these other agencies, just everyone we met with. We heard about things like forever, the industry has suffered from lack of funds. And right now the challenge is scaling up to take advantage of the funds. After all these years of starvation, now is the moment. And I think we all felt the urgency. And I think we all felt that sense that we're part of that transformation. And as we met with our electeds and their staff members specifically, I think they were feeling it through us, sort of that place of contact. We are at that place of transformation in our communities, whether it's working toward greater equity, whether it's greater prosperity or greater sustainability. We are at that place of transformation. And so I think that's what I came away with this. We have a role to play, and we know we've got opportunities ahead of us.
And I also want to ask Dina for her perspective. She was able to come to DC with us.
Thanks, Matt. First, I will echo most of what Jesse said. Everything that you said was spot on, and so there's not a lot other than I would like to point out that we were told on several occasions how great it was to have board members in attendance with us. And so I just want to thank the board for their support in that. It's not easy. It's a lot to go. It seems like it'd be really fun, and it has its moments, but it's very arduous actually. It's long days, lots of walking, lots of visits, lots of kind of telling your story. And so to echo kind of what Kathleen said, one thing we heard throughout the conference also, and Nuria Fernandez spoke to this specifically, how important stories are. So what you're hearing in Lansing is also what we're hearing from Washington, D.C. So this is very powerful. It's very important to have our message and to get our stories out. And this gives us an opportunity to do that. And the board members being there establishes another level of credibility and support for all the work that we're doing day to day. And so I just want to thank you for that and point out to everyone how helpful that is. Also, I guess I would just like to close with saying that the point that you made about being shovel ready, that's spot on. And we've known that for some time. And so when we went to Washington, D.C. this time, we really didn't have a big ask, but we're looking forward to when we do. And I think the fact that we're valuing what has already been provided and putting that to work as quickly as possible was well received. And so I just wanted to point out that it establishes another layer of credibility that when we do get money or awarded grants or earmarks, that we are going to be ready to go and ready to spend them. So again, I think that was a really good point. I just wanted to underscore that. So thank you.
Yeah, so in closing on this point, I think it was broadly in both cases, a great success. I was very happy with how everything turned out. I'd never brought board members to either event before, and I was just really happy to see it all come together. I think it was a great practice run for all of us. I'm looking forward to the next times we do this, and we'll be a little more ready, a little more prepared. I do have more work to do on the staff side for the advocacy agenda. As I mentioned, the whole local thing, I haven't even touched that yet formally. I am still working on recruitment for the manager of public affairs and communication. I hope to have news for you before long, and that's the extra horsepower I really need to get take this to another level. So I'm looking and frankly focus on the local stuff as well. We will go, I hope, every year with APTA and MPTA. I hope in the future board members will be able to accompany me as well. Dina is right. It's not a small contribution of time, so I really do appreciate that. And there's nothing to say we can only go there with APTA or MPTA. We can go there anytime to talk to folks. So there may be specific times and specific reasons. And we did hear a couple of interesting points that were different than what we were doing. One of our colleagues here in the state, I asked him, are you going to go meet with your elected officials? He's like, nah, but I'm going to go make a big pitch over at the FTA offices. Like, oh, that's how you do it. Okay. And Susan and I heard from another state that I thought was very eye-opening in terms of, how are you doing over in Eugene, Oregon? Oh, good. We've been here for days. We hunt as a pack on the local level. The city, the state, the region, the school board, the transit authority, we all get together months in advance and suss out our agenda, coordinate our asks so that we're going in and not tripping over each other. And that was, I don't know about Susan, but that was sort of jaw-dropping, eye-opening for me in terms of, in both cases, that's our competition for the federal money. Those are the people we're playing against in terms of how we're going to win. So good to know. That's what we got to do. That's the game we got to rise to. So I'm very happy with this first round. I look forward to doing it again with all of you. And I will let you know. Hopefully we'll have some good announcements in the near future about additional resources being brought to bear in this category. And don't forget the local stuff. That's on there, and that will get very close to ownership linkage, and we will tie our legs together and hobble down the field. Okay, thank you.
Are you saying we're going to sack race? All right. Well, that was, I was really excited to hear about the APTA venture, especially having attended the MPTA. It sounds like you had a very fruitful time. Next on our agenda is 7.2, our business plan. Matt, you are not done speaking. It's your turn again.
Thank you very much. I'm done. No, but I am going to ask Rosa Maria to help make this presentation. Just as a quick stage setting, every year staff recommends an annual budget to the board based on the goals you've given us in your ends and the constraints through the executive limitations policy. We start in the late summer, July. Our fiscal year ends in September, so we ask you to approve a budget then, begins in October. But here, earlier in the year, we start this process in sort of a nice slow roll by talking about the business plan. The business plan, you could think of it as the first chapter in the budget. It's where we talk about the big picture projects, the big picture priorities without any dollar signs. We're just trying to make sure we've got the right conceptual framework, conceptual work plan, and priorities together. This is also very explicitly an opportunity for us to make sure we're all on the same page. Before Dina begins doing the hard work of crunching numbers, I want to streamline the budget process so that when I give her direction on the budget, I've already spoken to you guys. I have a higher degree of confidence that we're all on the same wavelength in terms of what that all look like. So with that, I'm looking forward to Rosa walking us through this first draft.
All right. Thank you, Matt. And I would like to just note that, as Matt noted, this is a draft form, and it will take all of us collaborating together to make sure that we are able to get to the final version of all the projects before we can get into the budget planning process. So as you can see on the screen, I'll begin with providing the purpose of the business plan, and then I'll provide the priorities that guide the planning process, and then we'll go straight into the projects that are in the business plan. So the corporate business plan, the purpose of it is to align the work that is done at TheRide with the community's interest. So it begins with the board interacting with our owners through ownership linkage. From there, you provide us with the outcomes that you would like us to see. From that, we create plans with detailed projects and initiatives. We've had the long-range plan, which is a 25-year plan. And now we have the corporate business plan, which focuses on 5 to 10-year projects. The second purpose of the business plan is to help streamline the budget process. So the projects that are in the business plan, during this phase, we will be having those discussions. We agree on the timeline on which plans to actually, on which projects and initiatives to actually tackle right now or next year. Before it's budgeting, it's a budgeting process, because once it gets there, then it will be easier if we can just put the dollar amount to the projects and to the initiatives. So the purpose of today's presentation is to ask for your feedback. We'll be asking for your feedback in terms of the priorities that we have provided. Are those the right priorities? The projects and initiatives that we're talking about today, are those the right projects that we should be tackling right now? And if you should have any changes in terms of the way we sequence it, we would appreciate that information. And should we change the sequencing, it would be nice to also get feedback on where can we have trade-offs. So if we're moving a project further away behind, which project, or further away forward, which project should we move further away behind? So just to provide information on the structure of the business plan, the fiscal year 24 business plan has two main plans in it. It has the 5-year operating work plan and the 10-year capital plan. And these two plans eventually form the base of the 5-year operating budget and the 10-year capital budget. So the priorities for the fiscal year 24 business plan was, one, retaining the current customers that we have by maintaining the services that we have. And secondly, attracting new customers by implementing the long-range plan. And then finally, ensuring that we have efficiencies in the way we work. So we're looking at internally, is our software, working well? How can we improve that? The services that we offer, how can we improve that? As you can see on the screen, this is a 5-year operating work plan. It's also in your packet, and I will not go into the details of all the projects. So the business plan we provide it every year. We do this business planning project every year. So for the projects that are far away into fiscal year 26, 27, 28, I'll not go into the details of those. I'll focus on the first on the projects within fiscal year 24, 25. So just to orient you to this, if you remember, I mentioned we have 3 priorities. We have maintaining services, implementing the long-range plan, and continuous improvement. We begin with the priorities in the first column, and then the second column has the major initiatives, and then the few other columns we have the timelines. As you can see for this one, we don't have the first priority, which is maintaining services. And that is because we don't have any change initiatives per se. And that means that we will continue operating full service. We don't have any changes in terms of fares. And so we don't have any change initiatives per se in that priority. But moving on to priority 2, we do have some change initiatives, and these were in the millage. So if you remember, we had talked about having longer hours of operation system-wide, expanding overnight service in Ypsi and Ypsi Township, and having express service between Ann Arbor and Ypsilanti on the Washington corridor. Moving on to continuous improvement, we want to continue providing training opportunities to staff, as well as improving internal collaboration, looking for better ways to improve the customer experience. And as Matt just talked about, the advocacy agenda, that's something that we're really trying to get into so that we can get the money to do most of the projects in the long-range plan. And then in the fiscal year 24, we plan on having a study to look into ways that we can get into zero emissions fleet for TheRide, and another study in fiscal year 25 where we'll have zero emissions facility studies. Now, based on those studies, we'll decide what the next steps will be. Moving on to the 10-year capital project plan, it's set up the same, so it begins with the priorities and then the initiatives and then eventually the timeline. Under the priority of maintaining existing services, we plan on replacing all the vehicles that are past their useful life. And for the vehicles that are still having some useful life, we may need to replace their engines or the batteries and so on and so forth. So we want to be able to continue having equipment for those. In fiscal year 24, we'll continue with work that has to do with rehabilitating the Donga Bay Operations Center. Moving on to the second priority, implementing the long-range plan. We plan to commission, so the C over there stands for commissioning, commissioning the YTC within the timeline that has been provided, and all those projects within the timeline that has been provided. I'm not going to go into the details of it because you already have this information. But I want to note that all these projects are really dependent on funding and also staff capacity as well as key stakeholder collaboration. Moving on to continuous improvement. As we had mentioned previously in the ENDS policies, we are planning on continuing bus stop improvements as well as bus lane improvements. We're already having conversations on the propulsion study. And we're moving forward with that based on the long-range plan. We plan to have 100% of our fleet zero emissions by 2038. And also we're conducting studies right now to look at our infrastructure, our software, our information technology software and hardware. Is it good? What can be improved? Is it legacy systems? Do we need to replace it? And so on and so forth. So those are the two main plans. I will highly encourage you to look into the details of it. The business plan in your packet has details of each project, so please look into it and provide us your feedback. We would also like to know if the priorities we have, are these the right priorities? Is there something that we're missing before we move forward with that? So the projects are priorities and also the way we're sequencing our projects. You can send us your feedback at tellus@theride.org. And in order to have this information in the updated business plan form during the next board meeting, would appreciate to have your feedback by April the 6th. And just to recap everything that I said, the feedback that you provide will be very helpful so that we make sure that the projects we have are what we should move forward with before we get into the budget season, because those are the projects that we'll be funding. Any questions? That's it.
And I'll jump in just as a couple of closing remarks to reiterate a few things Rosa said. Very well done, by the way. We're only introducing to you tonight. We don't expect you to have digested it all. We'll be talking about it with you in committees and next month as well. So this is just sort of an introduction. The CEO can ask for advice from anyone, and I am intentionally asking for advice from you. So I do want your feedback on these sorts of things. We try to meet the board at a high level, because that's sort of where the policy governance structure wants us to stay. So when we prepare our budget, we generally don't prepare a very detailed line item sort of budget for your consideration. We keep it at a higher level, compliance with your executive limitations policies, advancing your goals at a high level, but we generally don't prepare to go line by line. But we want to make sure if you have questions in that level of detail, please, now's the time, if you can, think ahead to what you might want to ask if there is a detailed question. That way we sort of have enough time to sort of think about how we would answer that question. The biggest challenge every year with the budget is you get down to the last 48 hours before your fiscal year ends, and you're up late and the spreadsheets are out and people are recalculating things. No, that's why we're starting so early in the year. But it does put a lot of pressure on you as a board to think about a budget months in advance, to think about your expectations, think about your policy expectations as a group. And yes, I'm kind of curious about your individual perspectives as well. So now is the time for that. Thank you very much. Rosa did an excellent job. And we can take any questions now about process or content, but we'll be coming back to you in committees and at the next board meeting as well.
Susan?
Just, if you don't mind, clarification. So you want us to get a hold of TellUsTheRide.org, or you want us to bring questions back to this body, or do you want us to bring the questions to committee? I'm confused, I heard all
Sure.
three.
If I might, we're also usually reaching out to the public at this stage, so the email is kind of geared towards them.
I've got it.
We would love to hear from you more directly,
Okay.
both in committee and also by phone if you're so inclined.
Okay, great. Thank you. Good job.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments for Matt or Rosa Maria? Jesse?
A couple, just two things. One, I noticed, I think, some inconsistency on the garage commissioning date well, they're both page 15 of the other, there are two, there's also a pagination issue, but so it's on page 46 of the packet and page 48 of the packet. It's listed in one place commissioning is 2028 and one place as 2030. The Gantt chart has it as 2030, but the the breakdown has it as 2028. It's just maybe.
I'll look into that and update with the next version.
And then I guess maybe just an early, very specific question. The priority service. This is planned for 2027. The priority service from Packard down to Ellsworth. It was interesting to me that the other priority services that we were starting off with all corresponded to anticipated BRT lines, except for that one. The anticipated BRT line, according to the long-range plan, was on State Street, and I was just I was curious what was behind the decision to focus on the priority service down along Packard. Or, I mean, and if that's not a question you have an answer to at this point, I can,
First,
I'm happy for you to give you time to prepare an answer to that for later.
We're putting Forrest on the hot seat now.
Hello? Oh,
Gotcha.
ready to go. Well, that's actually, in the long-range plan, we did propose different layers of service. So one of the top priority was bus rapid transit. So you're right, Jesse, it will be on Washington Avenue and then State Street. And then there are also a few we call priority routes, but not priority corridor. But those services will be enhanced, with signal priority, with QGen lanes possibly, and then maybe a limited bus stop. So when Rosa Maria mentioning that, she called priority routes, those are kind of a second, I would say second layer in the long range plan road network.
Yeah, it was just, and I saw, in the long range plan that Packard is, a planned priority route. It was just that the things that were transitioning to priority first were Washtenaw and then Plymouth, Nixon, which were both identified as BRT. So this just happened to be one outlier, and I was wondering if there was something that was going into planning the priority, working on the priority service on Packard in this one instance before working on BRT or before working on priority service on State. I was just kind of curious about that, just because it seemed a little bit different than the approach we were taking with the other routes.
So the bus rapid transit 2 corridors, service is already pretty good today, and then it will be enhanced with the express bus service and some initial service improvement. For those priority roads, we're going to introduce more service there. Right now it's still a key corridor today, but with some restructure of the network, it could make it better, adding more resources there. Not just mentioning some second party or QGen plan, but even just service alone, we can restructure the network to kind of align our current network to the future LRT proposal. So.
Do we have any other questions? Thank you so much, Rosa Maria and Matt, for that presentation. We appreciate it. Moving on, we are now going to talk about 7.3, the propulsion follow-up. That again is Mr. Carpenter. Matt.
Thank you. This is just another opportunity. We've also had it in committees. We had a big discussion or presentation about this a little while ago. Just a couple of updates to give you. The first, I think, is housekeeping, but an important one. I'm beginning to step back as sort of the de facto project manager of this work, transitioning it to our head of fleet, Troy Lundquist. So you may be seeing more information with his name on it, sort of as the administrative project manager. I really want to thank Troy. I very much appreciate beginning to move. I'm still very much involved as the executive project sponsor. This is something I'm still very interested in, so I'm still around. Troy's doing a great job under George's supervision as well. Already starting to set up some meetings. We've had some good conversations with Ann Arbor Planning, which is leading to follow-up conversations with their building codes group, which as soon as they said that, I'm like, yes, of course we need to talk to the building code, of course, and the fire department. Interestingly, and I think we bumped into this with the initial report, building codes for hydrogen storage and are still kind of a work in progress in a couple areas. So it's still sort of a moving target. We are also moving forward on something I've mentioned to you, I think, in past, that I want to make sure I hear from staff. We've talked a lot about staff engagement here in the past, and being able to have some influence over their future work environment is a big part of staff's engagement and buy-in into the organization. So seeing as how this decision will really affect the mechanics and technicians in the fleet services area, I've made a commitment to them that I won't make a recommendation to you until they've had a chance to tell me what they think of this technology. And that requires them getting up close and personal with it, getting their arms right into the machines and finding out how to take it apart and put it back together. Troy is approaching this with visits, field trip time. For the mechanics. We've got some visits scheduled to Flint, who already has at least, I think, 1 to 3 hydrogen buses, although they are older models. And Detroit, we're going to Detroit to see their Proterra electric buses, and we're going to get much more up and close. Hopefully that will be sufficient, but if not, we'll do more, which may include bringing vehicles here or sending our folks further afield. If that happens, I may approach you to see if any of you are particularly interested in accompanying them to sort of see what people say. Part of this, however, I'm trying to keep on the down low because I want the mechanics to sort of be driving this boat, not me or board members per se, but I want to give you an opportunity to hear from these folks as well, perhaps. So we'll see if we're able to do that. So the work is progressing. We are still sort of on track for grant proposals about a year from now. The date moved from May to April for this year, so I'm sort of assuming it's going to wiggle around a little bit next year. But when we were in DC, and I know Jesse and Susan heard me many times mentioning we don't have any asks this year, but gosh, golly darn it, next year we might be putting in some big things and letters of support, kind words at committees, that sort of thing. And I think the message was received there. So we're going to do our best over the next year to get this shovel ready. I know many board members still have, I think, very fundamental questions about the entire project, about the technology, and I accept that we still have a lot of work and discussions to have here. I look forward to that. I don't intend to bring you any sort of recommendation until after our annual budget is done. I think we need to get that sort of finished in September, but I'm targeting internally to really, and we can and will talk about it before then, but after September, really leaning into this for decision time, because I need to get a decision about what we are comfortable moving forward with, probably by January next year at the latest, because we've got a lot of paperwork that we've got to prepare. The grant has to be pretty bulletproof. Letters of support have to be gathered, et cetera, to get the grant application in. And hey, if I'm going to follow my counterparts thing and make a big presentation at the FTA building, I got to get that scheduled. So with that, just updates, I very much appreciate the feedback that has already been shared from you to staff at the committee meetings. I do know we have more work to do to sort of bring forward the numbers. That is still on the to-do list. I do know there are those of you who are very enthusiastic and some of you who are somewhat hesitant. I get it. But if there's anything, and we're going to keep working to get you the information you need. But if there's anything else any of you would like to share with me this evening after reflection on some of these discussions, I'm more than happy to hear that now. And I did get copious notes from the Finance Committee because I know Troy was able to be there when I wasn't.
We're going to open up the floor to the board. Do you have any questions or comments for Matt at this time? I just have one question. So we just had all those lovely power outages and they affected the Donga Bay Operations Center both times. And I'm wondering, as we go forward and we're looking at electric propulsion, are you going to try to hone in on how other agencies or how those things could be mitigated? Because we know that it is a very real possibility in our area.
Yes, and I think the snowstorms and ice storms were a very direct focus on one vulnerability of energy transmission, and it's not just with electricity. I mean, the idea of having to transmit energy is sort of a new. I haven't really thought about it for a generation or two, and now we really are thinking about it a lot. The second power outage, I actually went back in the bowels of the building to see the backup generator, and it is roughly the size of those two tables put together. It feeds off diesel coming out of the main diesel tank. It's probably original to the building, so 1984, and it was barely enough to power lights in a few offices. Most staff were working from home. I think it kept the heat on. The maintenance bay was inert. We couldn't raise or lower a bus. So it would not have sufficed. So the mitigation for battery electric buses would have to include a generator that could deal with this. The sizing of that generator is I think, the important question, because how you charge these buses, the phasing of it, when you do it, how often you do it, to what degree you do it, becomes a very complicated exercise. And that's one of the, I think, important considerations for us at a staffing and operational level. The extent of our sophistication in energy transfer right now is we put a fuel thing in the back of the bus and we click it and then we, okay, we're done, click next one, and that's it. Full diesel tank can probably run for 2 days before we need to refuel it. We are, right now, we would have no idea how to juggle through the sophisticated electrical charging thing. So if we go in that direction, we're going to have a lot of thinking that needs to be done about how to stick handle that sort of stuff, or buy a really big generator that could just charge it all. And that may be cost prohibitive, to be quite frank. These things get pretty expensive pretty fast. But there are ways to sort of offset it, and we need to kind of explore it. But yeah, the ice storm was an important indication of things we need to consider.
Any other questions or thoughts from the board? Seeing none, thank you, Matt, for that. Next on our agenda is 7.4, the CEO report.
Thank you. And before I ask Dina to come forward with a particular issue and a request of you, just a few updates from the general report. First of all, you'll see the report in there. Ridership continues to recover, continues to track national averages. I'm hearing it's even maybe a little bit better than this graph suggests this week. So way to go, team. Good job all around. We're very happy about that. On the second page, Transit Employee Appreciation Day nationally is March the 18th. So tweet your little hearts out. That's a great time to get on the bus and say thank you to your transit operator. And then finally, I had an interesting meeting this morning. I was asked to present the Washtenaw Health Initiative, which I hadn't heard of before, is funded in part by the Ann Arbor Foundation, looking into a variety of areas of concern regarding particularly seniors and older adults. They have decided to focus on transportation, and particularly county-wide transportation for seniors. So they wanted a bit of a workshop this morning. They had myself and 2 other speakers. Congresswoman Dingell was there for a short time, so I gave her a shout out, as was Representative Justin Hodge from the Board of Commissioners, not Representative, Commissioner Justin Hodge. And we had a very good and I think focused conversation, getting right to the heart of the matter of property taxes, jurisdictions. You know, the ride is here, but the ride doesn't have countywide jurisdictions. That's the Regional Transit Authority, and the county government itself was kind of the balls in their field. It was a really good group. There's at least 50 people there, mostly social service agencies from throughout the county. It was a good conversation. They seemed to really appreciate the information we were able to provide. I'll keep you apprised of how that goes. I was clear with them that, you know, we're happy to be a good neighbor, provide expertise and support, but there's only so far the ride can go because we have a jurisdiction and property taxes in a particular area, and that has to remain our priority. But it is good to know that there's interest out there, and hopefully they can find a constructive path forward. I suspect I will be asked for more advice in the future. So are there any questions about any of that before I ask Dina to step forward? Okay, so with that, we have an unusual situation that bumps into a rarely used executive limitation pertaining to my signing authority. And I want to ask Dina, our Deputy CEO for Finance and Administration, to update us and present you with a request.
Thank you, Matt. What you have in your packet is a request for us to, or for the board to authorize a continued use of contractual service expenses to support the finance department, given the lack of staff, the current staff in our department. We are down 3 staff in the finance department of 4. So we have 1 permanent staff in finance, and that's been the case for a few months now. Basically, this executive limitation says that we cannot exceed the CEO's authority of $250,000 without the board's approval if the contracts are not anticipated in the budget. So when we present the budget to you, there's a list of contracts in there that we expect to exceed $250,000. We share that throughout the budget process a couple times, and it's in the final budget document that you approved. We had no way to anticipate the staffing shortages that we have seen in the finance department and the unexpected loss that we experienced in November with a key staff member. So we had no way to know that we would need this extent of contractual services in finance. We do always use some contractual services for projects that we maybe don't have year round, or we're like we actually use a budget consultant for some of the assistants to put the budget together. So we do have a history of using consulting services in finance, just not to this extent, and was not anticipated in the budget. Just a little background, there was a little bit of normal attrition throughout the year where we there was our grants manager or grants coordinator took another position somewhere else. Then we had a change with the finance manager, which I think we're all manageable within our normal budgetary constraints. But when we had that 3rd loss in November at fiscal year end and calendar year end, when we have the highest level of requirements for regulatory reporting to the state and the federal government, as well as our normal financial audit on top of normal day-to-day activities. It's just not something that we could sustain without this kind of support. So we're requesting from the board approval to exceed the CEO signing authority through contractual services until we're able to find staff. We are actively seeking staff. I have done 4 interviews just this week in the last 2 days. We're continuing. So I'm trying to staff 2 positions right now, in addition to completing all of the work and completing all the other requirements. So this is not something that we're pausing on. We're moving forward. And as soon as we hire staff, we'll begin to phase out the consulting services. But we will still use them for probably a period of 2 to 3 months in order to support the transitions. So when we bring new people in, they have some support and there's some transition time there as well. And on the grant side, we're expecting that might take a little bit longer still to fill. And so we expect to continue to use consulting services there. With the completion of some of the projects, and by projects, I mean year-end reporting, just the magnitude that happens at year-end, some of those things have already started to be completed and are starting to wind down. The audit will be winding down. That will help as well. And so we expect already to be starting to think about how we're going to scale back and make those transitions. And the current invoice we received just this week is even lower than the ones before. So we're starting to see that decline. It's just going to take a little more time to get staff in the door and make those transitions, but it would exceed what we would have expected to do in a normal fiscal year. And I'm happy to answer any other questions that you have and respectfully request your approval.
Does the board have any, Mike, I see your hand raised.
As Matt and Dina know, I completely support what they have to do in terms of bringing in extra help under these circumstances. Absolutely. On the other hand, it's not clear to me exactly what kind of dollars they're looking at. And I would think that it might be wise that the board have a number that they approve above the 250 rather than just kind of a blank for that.
Do you want me to respond to that? Okay. So the difficulty around this is not knowing when we will be staffed or to what extent. We are certainly using them only as limited as we need to, but with only 3 staff or with only 1 staff currently, it's required. I think in terms of, I do have estimates of what we could think about, but I think in terms of the executive limitation, I'm thinking that it's really not about, it's more about just approving that we can use the contract above the authority. But, we'll of course be happy to provide an estimate if that's something that the board wants to entertain. I will say that if we bump up against that number, if we're not able to staff as quickly as we need to, and we need to come back, if you want to set an amount, and we can always come back if that's something that you're more comfortable with, as long as we can continue to maintain the services to meet the needs of the department. That's really all we need at this point.
Rich?
Oh.
I'm sorry, I didn't see you, Susan, I apologize.
That's okay. I was going to ask Mike what your thoughts were, but I would feel very comfortable lifting the limit and asking that on a regular basis, there would be reporting to the board members on the finance committee. I definitely understand this. You want to get the right people. I don't want to rush to hire and then have people that down the road are not the right team members. So I would rather expand this and then just ask that there is regular reporting on the concern, which is, how much more over 250 we are. But I don't personally feel the need to constrain the amount. I'm much more concerned about getting the right people to work with you in your department.
I would just like to add one thing I forgot to mention. There is a control in place, and that is the budget. We do not expect these costs in any way to result in any kind of a requirement for a budget amendment. We're going to be well within the budget approved by the board. So I see no risk there stemming from this issue at all. In fact, last year, the fuel costs were well higher than what these will be, much, much higher than what we would have anticipated. And we never really needed to do a budget amendment then. So we will be managing any increase in costs in one area throughout the budget process to stay within the board-approved budget.
Mike, did that answer your question or help you?
Yes, very much. I certainly realize that you're saving money having those staffed, unfortunately. But to hear that even a broader statement than that in terms of the overall budget, I feel fine about that. But I think it would be good to have periodic, maybe monthly reports on how that is. Maybe monthly is too often. I really don't know what might be reasonable.
I'm comfortable updating the board as however you prefer.
Rich?
Yeah, so actually Mike's question was what I was going to ask, but Dina's follow-up regarding the budget was the other question I had. The thing I have then is this is just a temporary implementation, right? Like we're not doing a permanent change and lifting the limit. I just want to confirm. So, okay, thanks.
Matt?
Thank you. Thank you for asking that question because it hadn't occurred to me. This in no way, in my impression as the CEO, in no way voids the broader policy that this constraint of 250 on my signing authority otherwise is in full and permanent force. No question, very isolated to this one temporary situation.
Jesse?
I think to that end, if we make a motion, I'd like to maybe include like what the deadline is on this, because right now the recommended action doesn't have any sort of deadline. It just asks for that we authorize contractual expenses beyond $250,000. So do you know roughly like how long would you want before you'd want to be able to be required to come back and ask again?
Well, it would only apply to this fiscal year for sure. I don't expect this to go that long. I do expect to phase, my initial timeline is I'd probably be phasing this out over the next 3 months. That's what I'm hoping, but again, it does depend on the staffing levels. If there's any continuation or future need, that now that we know the situation exists, if there's any future requirement that we think we would exceed this amount in the next fiscal year, we'd put it in the budget. It would be, a line item just like every other contract. So it's definitely not open-ended. It really only applies to this fiscal year.
That being fiscal year 23?
The one we're in now, yes.
Okay.
Yes. So
And that ends in
yeah.
May?
September.
Okay.
Matt?
And if I might, I think I've heard 3 options from you in this discussion about how you might modify the motion, because Jesse's right, like it's very vanilla wording. You could authorize it with the reporting, as Susan suggested, but with no hard cap on the dollar amount or the time. Or you could do a dollar amount and we just come back and ask. You could put a time deadline on it. You could do all 3. All those things are up to you. It's just a question of what you want to have consensus with amongst yourselves and put into the authorization.
Can you repeat those 3 things again? So the first thing was the cap of the 250.
The first thing was to expand it, but with regular reporting, no time limit, no dollar amount. The second was to establish an amount. And the third was to have the time limit, I think. And again, just to repeat, since I have the microphone, to repeat, I'm more worried that you get the right people. And if you have to go back out again, I'd hate to have you come back to us again. I'm personally very comfortable within this fiscal year, if you can find the right people, do what you need to make sure that we're able to address our finances and get the right team. That's a harder piece than, you need to do this in 3 months. If it's not the right fit, I'd like you to then go back out and find the right person. Because again, these are long-term impacts to your team.
Simi, did you? Okay. Jesse?
Mike, I kind of might look to your experience on this. If we were to ask for reports, do you think, do we have any, do you want that to just happen with the quarterly financials, or do you think we would need to monitor this more frequently than that?
I don't think it has to be modified or monitored more frequently than that, but I think part of a quarterly report would be appropriate. I think also that it should be limited, particularly from what was said by Dina, to the fiscal year. That's still quite a few months out. And if that's not, that may not be adequate. If it's not, I think they'll have very favorable reception in terms of if it's necessary to extend that, it would be extended.
Would someone like to begin a motion to sort this out in terms of, I think what Susan and Jesse both, and Mike have just said is that we would like to add some sort of regular reporting, but we feel that the quarterly report would be a fine place for that to be. We don't think we need to establish an amount. Is that what I'm hearing? Because we want this to happen, and we're very confident with Dina and talking about having this wrapped hopefully up in 3 months, but if it takes the fiscal year and we understand that it's not going to put us in any sort of budget crisis, so then I don't know that we would need to add a time limit. So what we're looking at is just adding to the motion a regular reporting mechanism, which would be the quarterly report. So go ahead.
I think we should put in the time limit of fiscal year 23.
Okay.
And then if services are needed beyond that, they can just be included as part of the budget for fiscal year 24.
Is there any other dialogue on that? If not, Jesse or Susan, would you like to make a motion?
Sure. I'd like to move that the board authorize contractual expenses for financial services beyond the CEO's authority of $250,000 to maintain financial operations through the remainder of the year, fiscal year 23, with a report to be given as part of the quarterly financials.
Do I have a second?
Second, and only adding, and it's only authorized for this fiscal year. But yes, I'm second.
Okay. All those in favor, please raise your hands. We're missing Simi. Is it okay? I don't think we should.
1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
6. Okay, we're good.
You're still at quorum.
We're still at quorum? All right, well, then that motion passed.
Was
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6.
yeah, and what was it unanimous? Yeah.
It was unanimous,
Wonderful.
yes. Beautiful. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
All right, well, that closes out the CEO report. Matt, is that correct? Okay, great. Then we're going to move on to Section 8, emergent items. I don't have anything. Does anyone? Seeing none, we'll move on to closing items. That gives us our action item recap. That's Mr. Carpenter and Mr. Holt.
Thank you. As I have it, we're expecting ownership linkage information to be sent by Mr. Chang. We are still looking for participants for the Government Services Task Force. We're looking for 2.
I would like 2 more if we can, yes.
Okay. Am I authorized to tranquilize board members and bring
I
them in?
think that
Okay,
would be
maybe
a
not.
little
Maybe
bit
not. All right.
beyond your.
Okay. All right. There's a limitation there. You did approve a change to the monitoring report schedule. You also changed several policies per the construction policy. So we will be updating the board policy manual and getting that information back out. If you do have your physical binders, Perhaps next month, if you don't mind bringing them in, we can begin swapping out pages for you. Or we'll just send a PDF. This is fine too. Trying to accommodate everybody. We're gonna create a straw man. I would like to create a straw man, and you seem quite willing to help me, Jesse. Beat that up over 111. So we're gonna have fun with that. We've asked you for feedback on the business plan. We'll continue discussing it through committees, but we'd love to get your thoughts. Any other thoughts on propulsion? We've got a long to-do list on the staff side, but if something occurs to you, feel free to pick up the phone, drop me a line. And you have approved a motion, and thank you very much for precisely coming to, that was very quick, actually. Continuation of financial consulting services, and I know Ms. Reed is relieved. That's what I have. Did I miss? What did I miss?
Rosa Maria, what was the date that they needed to have responses back to you? Okay, that was the only other thing.
Okay, not bad. Was there anything else from the board that I might have misplaced?
So I love this action item recap. The question I have though is, I don't know who tracks and kind of prods us, because like I made note of, for instance, like my task, but I don't know if it's worthwhile to get this somewhere that we can.
I think it's in the minutes. And I hold a knife to the staff and get them to do their side of it. I can't compel you to do your side of it though.
Well, I'm just saying like the full, because the minutes don't come out until
That's true.
like before the board, right?
No.
So, no.
No.
Oh. Oh, they are. Oh,
Oh,
okay. Apologies. Thanks.
All right, so with the action item recap completed, we'll go on to 9.2 topics for the next meeting. We'll be talking about the governance processes policies. It says 3.0 to 3.8, but since we modified that, that would then be 3.4 to 3.8, and then 3.0 through 3.3 would then happen the following month. We're going to be looking at financial conditions, 2.5, cash and investments, 2.6, and communications and support to the board, 2.10. Yes, Mr.
you'll also have the audit.
Yes, thank you.
So Dina will be here and the rest of executive team. It's just kind of.
But with that, I think that's everything that's going to be happening next month. Is that correct? Did we miss anything, board? No? Okay, great. Next thing on our agenda is 9.3, our public comment. Deb, is there anyone in the wings?
We have no more public comment tonight.
It's a quiet night tonight. Before we adjourn, I just want to say thank you to everyone for all the hard work that everyone has been doing, staff and the board. It was a really productive meeting tonight. Do I have a motion to adjourn? Susan, seconded by Rich. And all in favor? We are adjourned. Good meeting.